Now, more discussion on how former Governor Mitt Romney might govern as president if elected this fall, and how he might work with Democrats in Congress. We're joined by members of Congress, including Utah Representative Jason Chaffetz and California Representative Mary Bono Mack.
Yes, I think we are. We have one more panel for you, and after hearing from Ed Gillespie and Glenn Hubbard and John Kyle about the nature of the agenda that Mitt Romney is running on this year, we wanted to kind of provide a little bit of a reality check of how these ideas might be received in Congress and among the elements of the Republican coalition. And to do that, we have a terrific panel of participants and observers in the Washington Scrum on my far left, only in a physical sense. Jason Chaffetz, a Republican representative from Utah in his second term. He sits on the Budget, Judiciary, and Oversight and Government Reform Committees. Mary Bono Mack represents a district in California's Inland Empire and has been in Congress since 1998. Vin Weber is a managing partner and co-founder of the advocacy and lobbying firm Clark and Weinstock, a former Republican representative from 1980 to 1992, and a key figure in the Conservative Opportunity Society in that era, which fundamentally transformed many things about the House and the Republican Party. Let me start with where David and Major focus with Senator Kyle. Obviously, this is an unusual transition because if Governor Romney is elected president, he will not be inheriting a blank page. There are big decisions that have to be made during the transition around the whole series of issues known as the fiscal cliff. Congressman Chaffetz, start with you. What do you think, what should happen in the fiscal cliff? What would you like to see happen if Governor Romney is elected president?
Well, I like that optimism because I do think he's the right person at the right time. Governor Romney has said on day one, we've got to approve the Keystone Pipeline. He can do that immediately. He can start to repeal Obamacare, offering states waivers. We think that should happen right in day one. And then engage in tax reform. Now, tax reform is going to take a little bit longer to play itself out. But Governor Romney, then President Romney, will have this unique opportunity, I think, in the first 100 days to use that honeymoon period, to use the mandate that hopefully he gets from the country. And I think when he selected Paul Ryan, it was really a signal that we're not just picking somebody because of the geographical concerns. We actually want to do something and to lead. And to get the House Republicans, particularly the conservative side of the equation. I was ranked the second most conservative person in the House. Paul Ryan's weight, pushing this forward, going up to the House, encouraging us to do it, I think will be very persuasive.
But Congressman, if Governor Romney is elected, would President Obama have any incentive to allow any of the Bush tax cut to continue past January 1, or would the likelihood be that at that point you would be coming into a situation in which the entire tax cut has expired, and how might that affect the legislative options?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we take this opportunity as a country to realize something has to change. Anytime, what is the Rahm Emanuel quote, don't ever let a crisis go to waste. This is where we are right now in our country. It's the opportunity clearly to look at pro-growth economic policies, but also for the Congress and the administration to do a real sort of top-down look at what we're doing wrong. Look, our businesses are over-regulated, they're over-taxed, they're over-litigated. And I think that we really need to look at all of this in its entirety. And, this is one of the things I'm so excited about with Mitt Romney. As a businessman, he knows how to go through these things and to find out where we're going wrong. The American people believe, I'm more of a centrist. This is the only time I've ever been to the right of Jason. But the American people believe there is a sweet spot in public policy and that we need to find it. And I believe that Mitt Romney can do that we can find a real good energy policy and still protect the environment. I'm an optimist in that regard, for example.
Let me ask an irritating and yet practical question. Let us say, unusual for me. Let's say Mitt Romney doesn't win. President Obama wins. Or Mitt Romney, let's just say for the sake of argument, Mitt Romney wins. And you still have President Obama presiding over the fiscal cliff and the lame duck session, which will obviously happen. And John Boehner and Eric Cantor go to the conference and say, we have a choice here. We either can tell President Obama we're going to produce no votes and let the Bush tax cuts expire and everything else expire for a short period of time and give Mitt Romney a fresh start, or we can cut a compromise now, which gives the new incoming Romney administration time, but it's a compromise with a defeated president. And because John Boehner and Eric Cantor go to the conference and seek your counsel, what would be your advice under that likely or possible scenario?
Is that to me or?
I think, for me, I don't want to see a tax increase. I think America's saying we don't want a tax increase. We do need tax reform. What we should do is in September, we should pass a continuing resolution, which is a terrible, awful way to govern. But go past that lame duck session. It should be palatable to both Republicans and Democrats, and give a new president or a re-elected president until March in order to help sort this out. But if that doesn't happen...
That's spending. That's not taxes.
But I think you can do it across the board. I think you can continue with the current trajectory of both spending and taxes. Just keep the status quo until March. Allow either a re-elected president or a new president to be able to have at least literally days to deal with this once they're sworn in January 20th.
President Obama is not going to sign a continuing resolution that extends the Bush tax cuts. Not in the teeth of a campaign where he's made that definition.
I think this is more a negotiation between the House and the Senate. I think the president would have a very difficult time to reject that if both the House and the Senate can move that forward.
Congressman?
I just wonder if you're basing your assumptions simply on election timing. And I think that you need to look at it, the sort of the perspective of where we are now and where we'll be post-November. And I don't know that they're one and the same. And I think that for all of us who set policy, it would be a mistake to think that where we are today is where we will be post-November.
You know, the agenda.
That's the critical.
Go ahead.
Expand on that, Ben.
You're assuming that the Congress will be acting in the same exact political environment in November, December as exists today. And what Congresswoman Bono, the point she has made correctly is the environment is going to change with the election. And the Democrats, assuming a Romney presidency, and I would think that would assume a Republican Senate as well, the Congress will come back with a different attitude towards these things. It will be much more difficult for the Democrats to be as obstructionist as your question implies if the country has just voted for a Republican government.
And even if that election ultimately produces something very close to a 50-50 divide in the presidency, in the Senate, perhaps Republicans holding the House, but with a narrower majority. I mean, it is possible that likely that the winner of this presidential election will have a lower share of the popular vote than Obama did, fewer electoral college votes than he did in 2008. If the country is closely divided, does that logic still hold?
Well, I think so. The country, again, I'm sort of back to the previous one. The country wants a new president to succeed. I mean, President Obama only got 53% of the vote, pretty good margin, but he came into office with a 75% approval rating. The country is going to want a new president to succeed. And if the new president acts appropriately, he can maintain that. My view is that one of the big mistakes that this president made when he first came in with a 75% approval rating was to outsource his first big policy decisions to House Speaker Pelosi. And this isn't because I think she's any better or worse than anybody else, but by giving it to the House of Representatives, you assured a partisan product, a partisan outcome, and I think it set the tone for the whole 4 years. A new President Romney will have an opportunity to shape a different environment.
Let me ask you one other thing, and we'll talk about his governing approach. We'll talk about that legislative approach a little later and how he might deal with Congress that way. But we were discussing with Glenn Hubbard and Ed Gillespie this question of what is immediate and what may be longer term. This is a very ambitious agenda. When you look at the elements of the Ryan budget, converting Medicare into premium support, block granting food stamps and Medicaid, tax reform that would reduce the top rate to 28%, limiting federal spending to 20% of GDP, repealing the EPA's ability to regulate carbon emissions, repealing Obama's health care plan, E-Verify and self-deportation. I mean, this is about as an ambitious agenda as we have seen since 1980. What falls under the cone of what Glenn Hubbard was talking about, in your mind, all of you, about what has to get done as part of that immediate goal of getting the economy moving faster again, and what might have to be put off for a later time?
I'll start because I really want to hear what they have. I think that the first, it seems a little drier, but I think the regulatory piece of this is very, very important. I think taxes are important. I think spending is important. I think the debt's important. But I don't think that we quite realize the extent to which the regulatory avalanche that's occurred under this administration has put a damper on economic growth across the board in every sector of the American industry. When Rahm Emanuel, on the first day of the Obama presidency, Rahm Emanuel issued a directive freezing all federal regulations, wanted to stop all the regulations the Bush administration had in the pipeline. I think that that's the first thing that we talk about day one. That is something you can do day one. You can stop the regulatory avalanche on day one and then begin sorting out and deregulating some of the things that have inhibited energy production and really every other sector of our economy.
This day one seems to be day one out of Genesis, by the way. It could go on for quite a while. What do you put under that cone of things that need to be done immediately and those that might be better put off for later fights?
Well, I agree with Vin. I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee, so I see firsthand the regulations, the regulatory approach, and how hurtful it is to job creation. There's no question that we should be looking at these regulations. And again, going back to the notion of how do we keep the American people safe. Of course we want to do that, but how do you balance it in a way that continues to grow the economy? That can be done, but the administration over the past 4 years has sort of artificially tried to move the markets through their mechanisms that haven't really resonated or been on track with true market conditions. And I think energy is the prime example of that. I come from a very expensive energy state, California, very expensive state altogether, and many would say the legislature in California doesn't do a whole lot of things right. But I'm fearing that Washington has been going more like Sacramento, and that's a huge mistake. So, I think that start with regulatory approach, and I don't know why, there's 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 in the Senate. We can do it all. We should do it all.
I think the markets, the American people need confidence again. I think the market, the capital is resistant to making the investments they need in order to grow the economy. What I think Mitt Romney represents is a very pro-growth economy. And if you don't get that confidence, and that's right out of the chutes, moving forward, it's going to be very difficult 4 years because the markets will hesitate. If Mitt Romney can show that he has that sort of confidence, the markets will start coming back. That naturally adds revenue to the Treasury, which makes your financial abilities much more profound. And I think will allow the Romney-Ryan budget and plan to actually move its way through the Congress. It's not supposed to be easy. No one person is supposed to get everything they want. We recognize that we have to do this. I do think, you asked earlier what one of the surprises will be. I think the country will be very pleased at how truly Mitt Romney works with the Democrats. He dealt with this in Massachusetts. 4 years as governor, 85+% of the legislature were Democrats, and they actually got some stuff done. They brought the unemployment rate down from 5.6 to 4.7%. So he can do this, and I think it would be probably the biggest surprise. I think that's where President Obama failed. They hoped that would happen. He projected that he was going to do that. It never materialized, and I think this will be one of Mitt Romney's great strengths.
I want to ask you about tax reform. Do you envision tax reform being the Bush tax cuts plus something else, or do you start from something that does not include or assume the Bush tax cuts? Point one. Question two, there were 2 Bush tax cuts, 2001, 2003. President Obama has cut taxes. You may not like those tax cuts. You may not like the 2% payroll tax cut. You may not like the work pay tax cut, but he has cut taxes. There are many economists who look at that accumulation of tax cuts for the past 12 or 13 years and still not the kind of growth we saw in the 80s or post-John Kennedy in the 60s. And they're wondering, do tax cuts have the stimulative economic effect that they once did? I'd like you to address both those.
I think the country is ready for what Paul Ryan says. We got to broaden the base and lower the rate. And you have to do that. Now, Democrats would argue they want to broaden the base, not lower. They want to raise the rate because they want more government. What Mitt Romney is saying, they want to broaden the base, get rid of those loopholes, get rid of those special interest loopholes that are out there, but not have a tax increase. There are literally thousands of them in the tax code. I watch because I voted against it, but there are tax loopholes for rum manufacturers, for racetracks in this country. I mean, they're chock full of it. And I think we can actually do this. And I think that part of the reason Mitt Romney selected Paul Ryan is because of his expertise on this issue. And if you ask Paul Ryan what he wants to do more than anything else in the world, it's tax reform.
In terms of economic growth, what we as Republicans believe, and what I think history, both in this country and elsewhere, has shown, is that all taxes are not equal. Lower marginal rates is the spur to economic growth. That's what we really believe in. And that can be achieved only really now through tax reform. A lot of the things we did, including in the Bush administration, temporary tax cuts, I don't think have any greatly stimulative effect to the extent that they do. It's sort of a short-term demand-side stimulus. But lower marginal rates here and across most of the rest of the world have usually resulted in higher economic growth. The Bush administration faced a number of serious difficulties. Remember, we had this little thing called 9/11 that took about $1 trillion out of the economy. I don't think the Bush tax cuts were all structured right, but I also don't think that they failed at a time when we were coming out of the recession after the tech bubble burst and out of the economic impact of the 9/11 impact.
Because that really is the question, because if you look at the experience of the last 3 decades, Reagan cut taxes, cut marginal rates. We got 17 million jobs, roughly 16, 17 million jobs over, right? Bill Clinton raised marginal rates, and we got hold on. We got 23 million jobs, 22 million jobs in his 8 years after raising marginal rates. Bush, again, cut marginal rates. And I believe the total net job growth over his 8 years, with all the other factors, was 1 million. When you look at that, why do you conclude that marginal tax rates are the key lever in changing kind of the trajectory of job growth when we've had job growth with marginal rate cuts, job growth with marginal rate increases, and then no job growth with the second round?
Well, I take the heretical position that the Clinton years largely benefited from the Reagan tax cuts. We got when Reagan came into office, top rate was 70%. When he left office, it was 28%. That is a dramatic, radical change, and it propelled growth throughout both of those. And by the way, Clinton cut the capital gains tax.
Would you put most of your chips on the? I mean, if you're thinking about why the economy would grow faster under a Romney presidency than it has under President Obama, what in your mind would be the key factor? Would you be putting most of your chips? Would your bet be fundamentally that lower tax rates lead to faster growth?
They obviously interconnect with a lot of things. Since Barack Obama took office until now, there are 143,000 additional federal workers on the federal payroll. We have more than 450,000 federal workers earning in excess of $100,000 a year. That doesn't count all the other benefits. I think the America looks at that and says, really, is the APA operating a lot better now that they've got hundreds of thousands of people? No. Is the transportation network in this country suddenly better? No. So can you cut literally tens of billions of dollars out of discretionary spending and have a more effective, efficient government? Yes. You couple that with the idea so that the markets, particularly the bond markets, then look at it and say, all right, this government is going to be responsible. We believe in Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan that they are going to actually balance the books at some point, not overnight. And you couple that with a more responsible government, and then you start doing some pro-growth things like energy exploration and energy development within this country. You start to have this combination where you get confidence, you get growth, you get revenue. I think that is the combination that the country is looking for.
Speaking of energy, you've mentioned energy a couple times. I want to ask you about the Romney energy plan and one feature of it that is striking, which is giving states control over the leasing activities for fossil fuel development or mineral development on the federal lands within their borders. Is that something that you think Republicans in the House will be comfortable with, Republicans in the Senate, or as a representative from California, would that give you concern?
Well, I think I don't have the answer necessarily to that, but I can say the way I would look at it and think about it is, in my district, again, we don't produce any fossil fuels at all, but we're very rich in renewables, very rich. But to give the people a say in what happens in their own backyard makes some sort of sense. I think in California, and we've been friends for a long, long time, transmission, we cite these new green, solar projects or all sorts of geothermal, whatever, but we can't wheel the energy. So if you invest in the people, you give them some local opportunity and input, of course you would think you'd get a little bit better result. But I just want to go back to one thing that I think is important, this whole tax conversation that we're having, lowering the corporate tax rate. I think it's ridiculous that we have the second highest in the world. But more importantly, when you boil this down to my perspective as a member of Congress, of all the years I've been doing this, there's one very powerful moment that stands out for me. And that was just before April 15th when I had a senior citizen literally crying because he was so frustrated with how complicated the tax code is. He wasn't crying because he had to pay his taxes. He was crying because he was afraid he was going to make a mistake and the government would come after him. That's a powerful moment as a member of Congress when you see when your constituents that afraid of the government and what can happen to him. So we've had a lot of conversation about the marginal tax rate and all sorts of things flying around here, but boil it down to what does it mean for our constituents. They want a much fairer, simpler tax code, and I think that we need to do that first and foremost. So,
and it needs to be revenue neutral. You would both agree with that, right? No net tax increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, the hallmark of what President Romney has said is, look, he's not going to earn kudos by taking care of the wealthiest. He wants to take care of the middle class. That's where his focus is. So he said for anybody who's got an adjusted gross income of $200,000 or less, he wants to bring down to zero the taxing on capital gains, interest, and dividends. That should be exciting to the middle class. So that's how you're going to get the economy moving forward. He's got something to prove there, and I think that's what he wants to do.
But how would you respond to the Tax Policy Center analysis that says most of the benefits would accrue to those who are wealthiest, and that inevitably, if you take away some of the deductions necessary to finance tax reform, inevitably, and if you look at their modeling on it, they try to assume very optimistic revenue estimates from tax reform. Even then, you have to raise taxes or take away deductions that affect and are beneficial to the middle class.
I'd say hogwash. Go talk to Paul Ryan.
Speaking of,
I seriously, that's why you pick Paul Ryan and you say, no, you're missing some fundamental aspects of it. And I have seen some of the analysis done by that policy center, and I disagree with it. And as some of the other former speakers.
You guys didn't resolve this with Glenn Hubbard.
Right.
Not gonna
Right. Let me ask you about the other side of the equation, and Ben, I want to start with you in terms of the Ryan blueprint, because it does envision, as we were talking about before, not only reductions in spending, but structural changes in big entitlements, Medicare in particular. The history of the last 30 years has been pretty bleak when one party has tried to do this alone. Right. 1981 with Reagan and Social Security, 95 with the House Republicans and Medicare, 05 with Social Security and Bush, and even in a different way, 09 with Obama, expanding an entitlement that did not have bipartisan support. In each case, there was political repercussions in the next election for the party that tried to change entitlements on a unilateral basis. So my question for you is, do you think, even if Republicans have unified control, we were discussing this at something else earlier this week, if Republicans control the House, the Senate narrowly, and Mitt Romney wins, would they be willing to transform Medicare from its current structure into a premium support system on a party line vote, perhaps a 50-50 reconciliation vote without any Democratic support?
You should ask the sitting members. Yeah. But I'll just say there is a difference. I understand what you're saying. And it is true that trying to reform these things on a partisan level has not been politically wise in the past. We do have a different situation now. As Ed Gillespie and Senator Kyle both said, the country is going broke. We can't not do this. Now, we could get into a big discussion about the long-term budget problem. Medicare is not the entirety of it, but it is absolutely impossible to solve the long-term budget problem without dealing with Medicare. So it would be better to do it with Democratic support, but we've got to do it one way or the other.
I'm not asking whether we should. I'm asking, do you think a Republican Congress in both chambers, we can ask them as well, would be willing to do this without Democratic support? Especially, can I throw one other condition? If Republicans achieve unified control, it will almost certainly be in part because they do extremely well, as they have recently, among white seniors, where they're running at 60% support. So I don't know how that figures in, but can you see them doing this? Whether or not they should, would they?
Paul Ryan has already led the House Republican Conference to vote for this reform. Why they would not do it when they have a Republican president who wants it is beyond me.
Okay. Would you need Democratic cover or buy-in? Are you prepared to buy in on a party line basis to go to transform Medicare?
I'll give you a personal example. I spent 18 months putting together a reform package on Social Security, and I sat down with Paul Ryan. We talked about that back and forth, and I said, Paul, what's the key to moving forward? And he said, as soon as you get a Democrat, we'll all jump on board. It's the best, smartest way to do it. And look at what Paul Ryan did with Medicare. The idea that he went out and got with Senator Wright. I think there are some very reasonable people that do want to work across party lines. He's as solid a Democratic credentials as there is. I think it would be a shortcoming for us to just plow through it without getting a Democrat on board.
You acknowledge that is a significant, to get Ron Wyden's support.
It's huge.
Paul Ryan had to significantly alter the original construct of that plan, allowing anyone to stay in Medicare as it is and not opt for the new plan dramatically reduces its budget implications and its transformative clout, does it not?
And I think one of the fundamental problems and challenges with the so-called Obamacare and what the Democrats did is they plowed ahead. They didn't bring any Republicans along, and it was their failing and their shortcoming, and it's why it's dead on arrival.
I just want to say we've moved the football in one regard. The American people know that we have to do something. I think that's a first. For the first time, they're recognizing, and I think you're seeing the backlash from that in California with things like the high-speed rail. Californians are rejecting that. They're recognizing we have to get our fiscal house in order. They are a part of this, and I think that might bring some Democrat votes along.
Real quick, before we hit midnight here, the same question I asked Ed Gillespie. I'd like each of you to think about: is there one area that you think that President Romney and a Republican Congress might move in a direction that today we don't expect? Immigration, energy, climate. A budget deal. Is there anything that you would think that might confound our expectations today?
I go back to what I said earlier. I think Mitt Romney will be masterful in his ability to work with the Democrats and be a reasonable person in interaction with them. He did it as governor of Massachusetts. I think he knows that's a key to success. And I think people will be pleasantly surprised by that.
It's my hope that he really does an awful lot to help the small businesses of America. I really think that he has the ability to reach out and help all of them, and I think he will surprise people in that area.
Glenn Hubbard started to talk about what I think is the right answer to that question. I think that people are going to be surprised to find that President Romney and his administration actually talk about and care about poverty in this country. This president doesn't talk about poverty. He talks about the middle class because that's more politically saleable. But I think that Governor Romney, given his background and his values, cares about that issue, and it will surprise people pleasantly to see some conversation about that in the new administration.
Well, maybe in 4 years we'll regather and see what the report card looks like. Thank you all for joining us, and Elizabeth Baker Keffer will have some final remarks.